Fort Smith Detachment Sector, Northwest Territories, April 1937, 11 o'clock in the morning. Constable Arthur Nelson, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, 4 years on his northern posting, was 6 days out on a dog sled patrol south toward the Slave River Delta. He had stopped his team on the wind-crusted ice of a Deadhead Bay to reset the tow line on his lead husky, a 4-year-old animal named King that had pulled 3,000 miles of winter trail between Resolution and Reliance. The temperature was -22. The wind was holding steady out of the northeast, and Nelson was 48 miles from the nearest telegraph key. He knew the ice under his runner had 3 feet of clear blue depth because he had chopped a waterhole at 6 that morning. He knew that if the wind turned north before nightfall, the drift along the willow bench at the delta would bury his trail by midnight and force him to sleep under his sled canvas. What he did not know, until a low twin-engine hum broke through the wind over the Spruce Ridge 2 miles to the west, was that the sky above his territory had just ceased to be empty. The biplane crossed the bay at 800 feet, its wooden skis painted silver against the dull gray overcast, the red and blue roundel of the force visible under its lower wing. It was a de Havilland DH-90 Dragonfly, one of 4 aircraft that Commissioner Sir James MacBrien had formally commissioned into service that morning to create the RCMP Aviation Section. For 20 years, since the force acquired its first motorized car in Saskatchewan in 1916, headquarters in Ottawa had turned down every proposal to put police constables into the air. In 1919, when returning wartime flyers suggested aerial patrols for the barren lands, the Department of Comptroller replied that dog teams and canoe routes provided all the mobility a northern constable required. Now, in 20 minutes of steady cruising at 120 miles an hour, those 4 wooden biplanes had done something to the Canadian North that no order in council had ever managed to put into words. What had the arrival of those 4 planes done to Constable Nelson's territory? What had the ability to fly over 1,000 miles of unmapped subarctic wilderness in a single afternoon due to the size of a detachment's responsibility, to the lonely autonomy of the officer on the trail, and to the speed with which headquarters in Ottawa expected answers from a country that had previously taken 6 months to reply? The creation of the RCMP Air Section on April 1, 1937, was not an incremental upgrade to existing fleet operations. It was a complete institutional departure. Commissioner Sir James MacBrien, himself an experienced aviator who had flown his own aircraft across Canada during routine inspections, purchased 4 de Havilland DH.90 Dragonfly biplanes directly from England. Registered as CFRCA, CFRCB, CFRCC, and CFRCD, these aircraft were powered by twin 130-horsepower Gypsy Major engines, built with plywood-covered fuselages, and designed with convertible undercarriages that could swap between high-pressure rubber tires, wooden floats for summer lakes, and heavy ash skis for winter snowpack. They were assigned 6 pilot officers, constables and sergeants who had earned civilian commercial pilot licenses at their own expense during their leave, and stationed at strategic operational bases across western and northern Canada. Before the Dragonflies took to the air, the physical reach of an RCMP detachment was strictly defined by the endurance of human legs and dog paws. A standard northern patrol covered between 20 and 30 miles a day. A major winter inspection, such as the historic dog sled route between Fort McPherson and Dawson City, required 2 months of continuous travel through blizzard conditions, carrying dried fish for the dogs and flour and bacon for the men. If a constable encountered an injured trapper, an unreported death, or a boundary dispute in December, his written report would travel by winter mail packet, carried by successive dog teams, arriving at divisional headquarters in Edmonton or Regina in May. The officer on the trail was not simply a law enforcer. He was the sole representative of executive authority for thousands of square miles, making decisions in complete isolation because no dispatch system existed to guide him. The 4 Dragonfly biplanes changed that equation overnight. A distance that took a dog team 3 weeks to cross was now covered in 2 hours and 40 minutes. Supplies that previously required a fleet of freight canoes in summer could be dropped beside a remote log cabin in a single morning. But this extraordinary acceleration of speed brought an immediate operational paradox to the northern detachments. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of Canadian patrol between 1900 and 1980. The vehicle, the posting, the territory knowledge that years in one place built in the officer who covered the same ground in 4 seasons, and the communities those officers served, in the full complexity of what that service meant in this era. Not Mountie mythology. The documented operational and human reality of patrol in a country whose geography required its officers to know their territory the way no centralized system has ever been asked to know it. What 4 twin-engine biplanes gave Ottawa in speed, they quietly took from the officer who used to know every mile of snow between 2 posts by the sound of his sled runners. And if you served in this era, or your family did, put it in the comments. Did you or your family serve in the RCMP Air Division or Northern Detachments during the transition from dog sleds to aircraft? Next week, we examine the 1958 Trans-Canada Highway Patrol cars and the officers who covered 500 miles of 2-lane asphalt without radar or central dispatch. Back on the road. To understand what the 4 aircraft altered in 1937, one must first look at what 11 years of dog sled patrol built in the officers who worked the northern posts. On the trail between Herschel Island and Aklavik, survival was not a matter of following an operational manual. It was an exercise in reading micro-territorial evidence that no mapmaker had ever recorded. Constable Nelson knew that on the east side of Big River, the river ice buckled upward over gravel bars every January, creating hidden air pockets under 2 inches of snow that could break a dog's leg or swallow a loaded sled. He knew that an Indigenous Dean guide could tell the approach of a 3-day ground blizzard 4 hours before the barometric pressure dropped, simply by observing the behavior of willow ptarmigan along the tree line. This knowledge was hard-won, dangerous, and deeply personal. In the winter of 1910-11, Inspector Francis Fitzgerald and 3 constables perished on the McPherson to Dawson patrol, the famous Lost Patrol, because they missed a critical trail turn in blinding snow, ran out of rations, and were unable to locate their emergency food caches. The lesson of the Fitzgerald tragedy was burned into every northern officer for a generation. On the ground in the Canadian North, your environment does not forgive ignorance. If you did not know which creek beds stayed open under snow insulation, which moss bogs supported weight in November, and how to feed 9 huskies on tallow and dried whitefish without causing pack fights, you did not complete your patrol. The dog sled patrol demanded that the officer live inside the land at 4 miles an hour. He walked on snowshoes ahead of the team, packing the trail down so the heavy sled runners would not sink. He felt the texture of the snow beneath his moccasins, noting the difference between dry, wind-packed drift that glided smoothly and wet, sticky salt snow near the coast that dragged like sand. He slept in canvas wall tents heated by sheet iron stoves, or in snow houses built when the wind blew too hard to pitch canvas. In this slow, grueling rhythm, the officer became part of the territory's seasonal pulse. He knew every trapper's cabin by name, every family's winter supply reserve, and every native hunter's traditional hunting territory. What happened to that deep, ground-level territorial reading when the officer was lifted 3,000 feet into the air and moved across the same landscape at 130 miles an hour? From the cockpit of a de Havilland Dragonfly biplane cruising at 3,000 feet, the Canadian subarctic presents a breathtakingly different reality. The intricate, painful details of the ground trail vanish into a grand visual mosaic of frozen lakes, dark spruce forests, and winding white river channels. Where Constable Nelson on his dog sled saw only the snowdrift 10 yards ahead of his lead dog's nose, the pilot officer in the Dragonfly could see 50 miles in every direction. Unmapped lakes that had never appeared on any official Department of the Interior chart were suddenly visible in their entirety, their shorelines cleanly outlined against the snowpack. This new vantage point instantly expanded the operational footprint of a northern police detachment. In 1936, the Fort Smith post was responsible for monitoring an area within a 50-mile radius of the log detachment building, an area that took a 2-man patrol 3 weeks to cover thoroughly on snowshoes. By the winter of 1937, with CFRCB stationed on lake ice nearby, that same 2-man detachment was tasked with patrolling a territory of 500 square miles. Ottawa expected the pilot officer to overfly 3 fur trading posts, 4 indigenous encampments, and 20 isolated trapping cabins in a single 4-hour flight. dropping mailbags and recording activity from the air. However, this massive expansion of territory introduced a profound operational trade-off. From 3,000 feet, an officer could see that a cabin had smoke rising from its stovepipe, but he could not see if the trapper inside was crippled with scurvy or out of ammunition. He could see that a lake was frozen, but he could not read the thin spots over spring-fed channels that would collapse under the weight of a landing aircraft. The airplane gave the institution vast horizontal visibility, but it stripped away the deep vertical intimacy of the ground trail. How did the pilot officers of the new air section adapt to flying over terrain where a mechanical failure meant forced landing in a wilderness where no rescue plane existed to find them? Operating wooden biplanes in the Canadian North during the late 1930s was a feat of raw mechanical ingenuity and extreme physical stamina. There were no paved runways, no heated hangars, no radar beacons, and no weather reporting stations between Edmonton and the Arctic Ocean. Every landing was an exploratory venture onto untested lake ice or snow-covered river bars. Pilot officers had to read the surface of the snow from the air, looking for shadow lines that indicated dangerous wind ridges, called sastrugi, or dark wet patches that signaled overflow water lurking beneath a thin crust of snow. In winter, when temperatures dropped to -40 degrees, preparing a Dragonfly biplane for flight was a 4-hour ordeal. Engine oil had to be drained from the dual Gypsy Major motors every evening, while still warm and carried inside the log detachment cabin to be kept beside the wood stove overnight. In the morning, constables wrapped heavy canvas hoods over the engine nacelles, draping the fabric down to the ice, and lit brass blowtorches under metal heating tubes to warm the cold cylinders. If an oil sump was filled without preheating the metal casing, the oil would freeze instantly upon contact, seizing the crankshaft before the engine could turn over. Hand-cranking a twin-engine biplane on slippery lake ice required immense physical coordination and courage. Standing on wooden skis, the officer had to swing the wooden propeller by hand, while another constable worked the cockpit switches, risking severe injury if his boots slipped on the blue ice. Once airborne, carburetors were constantly prone to icing in the damp subarctic air, requiring pilots to adjust manual heat controls by feel while navigating by dead reckoning using a magnetic compass and hand-annotated paper maps. Yet, despite these extreme technical hazards, the Dragonfly allowed the RCMP to reach places that had previously been virtually inaccessible. But as these aircraft flew deeper into the northern frontiers, what kind of institutional authority were they carrying into the isolated indigenous communities of the North? When a de Havilland Dragonfly touched down on its floats beside a remote Dene or Inuit settlement in the summer of 1937, its arrival represented the full, complex weight of Canadian federal authority. For the community on shore, the airplane was an object of immense technological wonder and practical utility. The police aircraft brought long-awaited mail from relatives down south, critical medical supplies to combat winter outbreaks of influenza and tuberculosis, and emergency rations when caribou migrations failed. It carried the Indian agent and RCMP officers to pay annual treaty money, settling accounts, and delivering official correspondence in hours rather than months. In medical emergencies, the Dragonfly was a life-saving mercy ship. Documented logs from 1937 and 1938 record pilot officers evacuating trappers with compound fractures, women with complicated labors, and children suffering from acute appendicitis, flying them through severe weather to hospitals at Fort Smith or Aklavik. In these moments, the aircraft embodied an undeniable institutional good, bridging vast distances to preserve human life where no other assistance was physically possible. Yet, the very same aircraft was also the instrument of policies that caused profound, lasting harm to those same northern communities. The Dragonfly was used by the RCMP to enforce federal game laws that restricted traditional indigenous hunting rights, impounding pelts, and penalizing families who relied on wildlife for winter survival. More significantly, aircraft were increasingly deployed to transport indigenous children from isolated northern camps to distant Indian residential schools in Fort Resolution, Aklavik, and Hay River. Parents watching an RCMP biplane land on their lake knew that it brought both essential medical help and the official authority that could take their children away to institutions hundreds of miles away. This dual reality was the true institutional context of Canadian northern policing in the 1930s. The pilot officer in the cockpit of CFRCA was not an iconic figure in a romantic frontier story. He was a working constable, executing the complex, often contradictory mandates of a federal government, extending its administrative reach over a vast geography. How did this rapid expansion of central authority alter the relationship between the officer in the field and the headquarters bureaucrats in Ottawa? Before the establishment of the Air Section and the installation of high-frequency shortwave radio sets at northern detachments, the chain of command in the RCMP operated on a foundation of mandatory local autonomy. A corporal posted to Tree River, or Cambridge Bay, in 1928, understood that headquarters in Ottawa was a distant abstraction. When a crisis arose, a shooting at a trading post, a dispute over trapping lines, or an outbreak of starvation, the officer had to investigate, evaluate evidence, render decisions, and enforce the law based entirely on his own judgment and his intimate knowledge of the local people and territory. He could not consult a supervisor. He could not ask for instructions. His report, written by kerosene lamp in a log cabin, would not reach the commissioner's desk until the ice broke 6 months later. The aircraft and the shortwave radio shattered this traditional autonomy. With the Dragonfly biplanes capable of moving officers rapidly between posts and radio operators at bases like Fort Smith and Edmonton beaming Morse code dispatches across the north, Ottawa was suddenly present in the detachment office. A clerk in the Justice Building in Ottawa could read a radio telegram sent from Aklavik at 9 in the morning, draft an official directive by noon, and have it transmitted back to the northern officer before 3 that afternoon. This dramatic shortening of communication time altered the psychological nature of Northern Command. Officers who had previously been trusted to exercise broad personal discretion found themselves subject to detailed, immediate oversight from superiors who had never set foot on Arctic tundra. Ottawa demanded precise flight logs, fuel consumption records, pelt confiscation reports, and instant updates on ongoing investigations. The unhurried, self-reliant pace of the dog sled constable was steadily replaced by the structured, time-sensitive demands of modern administrative management. What did this institutional shift mean when weather closed in, radios failed, and the pilot officer was forced back onto his own raw survival instincts on a frozen lake? For all its speed and technological promise, early police aviation in the 1930s was constantly checked by the unyielding realities of northern weather. The de Havilland Dragonfly was a light wooden biplane with limited instrument flying capability. It possessed no de-icing boots on its fabric wings, no heated windshields, and no blind flying radar. When autumn freezing rain or sudden winter blizzards rolled across the subarctic, the 4 Dragonflies were rendered completely useless. They sat grounded on lake ice, canvas covers lashed over their wings, while snowdrifts accumulated against their wooden skis. In these moments of technological failure, the institution was abruptly reminded that the airplane had not eliminated the harsh geography of the North. It had merely flown over it. If a Dragonfly suffered engine failure over the barren grounds, forcing a landing on an unnamed body of water 50 miles from the nearest post, the pilot and his passenger were immediately thrust back into the world of the dog sled officer. They had to survive on the emergency rations stored in the rear fuselage: hardtack, bully beef, and tea, build a snow shelter, and wait for a ground search team or attempt to walk out on snowshoes. Documented occurrences from 1938 record instances where pilot officers were stranded for up to 3 weeks beside grounded aircraft, waiting for fog to clear or replacement parts to arrive by dog team. In these situations, all the administrative efficiency of Ottawa meant nothing. Survival depended entirely on whether the pilot officer possessed the old trail skills, the ability to build an airtight snow wall, start a fire with damp spruce twigs in a 50-mile-an-hour wind, and construct crude snowshoes from aircraft wing wire and birch branches. The airplane had accelerated police mobility, but it had not replaced the fundamental necessity of territory knowledge. What happened to this pioneering air division when the world erupted into global war in September 1939? The operational life of the RCMP's 4 original de Havilland Dragonflies was remarkably brief, yet its impact permanently redefined Canadian police operations. When Canada entered the Second World War in September 1939, the entire RCMP Aviation Section, its 4 Dragonfly aircraft, its maintenance personnel, and its 6 veteran pilot officers, was formally transferred to the Royal Canadian Air Force to bolster national defense operations. Renamed No. 117, Coast Artillery Cooperation Squadron, the former police airmen were tasked with flying anti-submarine patrols and coastal surveillance along the Atlantic seaboard, bringing their cold-weather flying expertise to military service. With the aircraft reallocated to the war effort, Northern RCMP detachments experienced a temporary, nostalgic return to traditional patrol methods during the early 1940s. Constables once again harnessed husky dog teams, packed wooden sleds, and walked thousands of miles across winter ice to patrol their sectors. But the institutional memory had been permanently altered. The force had seen what aviation could accomplish, and there was no returning to a purely ground-based past. When the war ended in 1945, the RCMP swiftly re-established its Air Division, replacing the aging wooden Dragonflies with modern, all-metal aircraft specifically engineered for the Canadian bush, the legendary de Havilland DHC-2 Beaver and DHC-3 Otter. These rugged single-engine aircraft, equipped with powerful Pratt & Whitney radial engines, heavy-duty combination wheel skis, and large cargo doors, transformed police aviation from an experimental trial into the backbone of Northern territorial policing. By the 1950s, RCMP aircraft were flying routine patrols across the entire Canadian Arctic, reaching the most remote high-latitude outposts at Grise Fiord and Resolute Bay. But as these post-war aircraft grew larger, faster, and more sophisticated, the ancient tradition of the dog sled patrol was quietly entering its final decade. In March 1969, at the detachment in Old Crow, Yukon, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police officially retired its last operational dog sled team. After nearly a century of service, dating back to the Northwest Mounted Police patrols of the 1870s, the Husky dog team was formally replaced by gasoline-powered snowmobiles and multi-engine aircraft. The long, unhurried winter patrols that had defined northern policing for generations, where an officer walked 500 miles behind a sled, reading every ridge and stream bed at 4 miles an hour, had officially come to an end. What the change gave the institution: unbeatable operational speed, thousands of square miles of instant aerial surveillance, rapid medical evacuation capability, and direct, centralized control over every remote detachment from headquarters in Ottawa. What it did not give the territory: the deep, ground-level territorial intimacy of the officer, who spent 11 years walking the snowpack, who knew the precise thickness of the river ice by the sound of his sled runners, and who understood the quiet human rhythms of an isolated community because he had shared their slow, cold journey across the land. The modern aircraft flies over the northern tundra today at 300 knots, guided by satellite GPS and digital dispatch. It gets to the remote settlement in minutes. It does not know the thing the old dog sled constable knew about the snowdrift along the willow bench on the Slave River Delta. Nobody asked what that thing was before the last husky harness was hung on the detachment wall for the last time. The Canadian North is still there. It still presents the same severe cold, the same sudden blizzards, and the same unyielding frozen expanse. The territory has not changed. The knowledge is somewhere else now. If this channel is going to keep documenting what Canadian patrol officers knew about their territories and what it cost the institution when that knowledge left, subscribe. There are more roads, more detachments, more crossings, more calls with 3 pieces of information the dispatch did not contain, and none of it was ever asked to write itself down. What 4 twin-engine biplanes gave Ottawa in speed, they quietly took from the officer who used to know every mile of snow between 2 posts by the sound of his sled runners. And if you have a patrol route, a posting, a winter road, a detachment, put it in the comments. Did you or your family serve in the RCMP Air Division or Northern detachments during the transition from dog sleds to aircraft? Next week, we examine the 1958 Trans-Canada Highway Patrol cars and the officers who covered 500 miles of 2-lane asphalt without radar or central dispatch.